global climate deal is unanimously adopted and outpouring.
It has been able to rebuild the trust that was lost at Copenhagen's.
The deal ends decades-long doubts between rich and poor nations.
A legally binding agreement to limit global warming.
There was a great deal of celebration as things came to a conclusion today.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're tracking this week. Climate change and the coverage of an issue where politics, science, and journalism meet. The reporter behind one of Chicago's biggest news stories this year drives a cab part-time. How did he break a story that the mainstream news media could not? Is the sale of this newspaper another sign that Beijing is squeezing the life out of freedom of the press in Hong Kong? And cruising YouTube for some raw political material.
I love you.
There are few news stories that truly have global implications. Climate change has implications that are planetary. But by nature, it's a slow-moving story, a slow burn, so to speak. It requires a big development, an event, to attract the attention it deserves to top the news agenda. The United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP21, was such an event. Political leaders, delegates, advocates, and journalists from around the world flocked to Paris. Anyone trying to assess the agreement reached as the conference closed could have concluded through the happy headlines, the self-congratulatory political leaders, that it was job done. However, many climate scientists say that this deal falls well short of what is needed to tackle this problem. So why would the story be framed that way? Starting with the obvious, the coverage reflected the will of the leaders who passed the deal, some of whom have a lot riding on it. This is also a story that tends to be reported differently along geographical and political lines, one that begs questions about just how representative mainstream news narratives are when it comes to the places most affected by climate change. Our starting point this week is Paris. Journalists know all about deadlines. Many of them deal with them every day. And the headlines they would publish were probably already prepared. The one they would use if the political leaders they were covering in Paris reached an agreement, and the one they had in case the conference failed.
Planners at media organizations find it very easy to send journalists to big events where outcomes are expected. So that's why you get lots of coverage of summits and not so much coverage of the sort of underlying causes and these slowly changing circumstances. The atmosphere in that big hall was electric, a lot of emotion, so I wouldn't blame journalists for getting caught up in it.
Politicians are the most important agenda setters in terms of the news media. So when Hollande talks about a leap for mankind,
Ce sera un acte majeur pour l'humanité.
That will make the news headlines. That's exactly the kind of thing that the contemporary media love.
And it was very interesting to see this mirror between what politicians were saying, what the media was saying. They all echoed a very similar narrative. They were using very, very similar terms, language, frames.
The New York Times talking about it being a landmark, the BBC talking about it being the best chance to save the planet. And I think those headlines do reflect rather more than, in fact, what was achieved at COP21.
Journalists from the global south and the countries feeling the punishing effects of climate change saw the story differently. Those countries wanted binding agreements in 3 areas. A hard carbon emissions reduction target to limit the warming trend to 1.5 degrees Celsius. They didn't get it. The pledges agreed to are voluntary, not binding. They wanted firm, legal recognition of the principle that the most polluting countries, which have 10% of the global population but do 60% of the damage, must compensate the countries paying the price. They didn't get it. And they wanted a hard number, a compensation fund, flowing mostly north-south to help the people worst affected. The number was lower than they wanted, $100 billion a year, starts later than they wanted, not until 2020, and the money has strings attached. It's not a firm commitment. As the New Internationalist put it, the agreement came down to what the wealthier, most polluting countries were prepared to deliver, not what science and equity demanded, which is a line that headline writers in the developed, more polluting world could have used, but didn't.
The climate negotiations, of course, represent every single country in the world. But that doesn't mean that they have equal power. Many of the poorer, most vulnerable countries have delegations of only 1, 2, 3 people. And media, that is also just 1 or 2 people. While the richer countries come with delegations of 3, 4, 500, and similarly, they come with very, very powerful media operations as well. People who control the 24-hour media cycle to amplify and echo their narrative, it really makes a huge bit of difference.
And so in our own part of the world, we present the climate change story from the human angle perspective, which is the fact that the common African in Nigeria, where I come from, and in Zanzibar, in Nairobi, and all parts of Africa are affected by the historical polluting actions of countries in the West. Because at even less than 1.5 degrees C, we're already experiencing desertification. And so it is not a thing of compensation, but it's more of there is need for climate justice in Africa.
The narrative coming from media in the global south, the demand for what is just, is at odds with the idea still contained in reporting from further north and from the west, where the question can still be just what is climate change and is it really man-made? The Western, more developed world, which produces the bulk of the science concluding that carbon emissions are the primary culprit, also produces most of the journalism questioning those same scientific conclusions. Do those news outlets really take issue with the science? Or is it the journalistic pursuit of objectivity, a recurring flaw in news coverage where the quest for balance often results in a form of bias?
Skeptical media coverage is largely a phenomenon of the Western media. One of the factors is that we have largely a neoliberal press in the West that's very receptive to these arguments. With climate change, that's quite difficult because the science, there's a large consensus on it. You need to create debate, so you bring in political commentators who are going to dispute the science.
Well, we can talk now via an internet connection with the climate change skeptic, Dr. Benny Peiser. He's
creates conflict, which media producers really do like.
Where you find skepticism most in the media is the United States, the UK and Australia. What you think about it is largely driven by your politics. So what you tend to get is right-leaning newspapers, for example in the UK, like the Mail or the Sunday Telegraph or the Express Group, they will give a lot of voice to skeptic arguments, whereas left-wing or left-leaning newspapers will not. And the same sort of thing happens in the USA and Australia. And the newspapers largely reflect the views of political parties who might be skeptical.
The reality, of course, is that we live in a globalized world where companies are multinational companies. People have interests in media, in mining, in extractives, etc. There's a bleed now between all sorts of different companies, and that definitely helps shape the kind of narratives. Many of these people are trying to protect their bottom line.
And if this really is another journalistic exercise of following the money to find the real story, that's not limited to reporting from the global north. Journalists from Africa are not immune to being led by their political leaders. And on this story, even though the compensation fund agreed to in principle in Paris was not as big as the countries victimized by climate change demanded, those countries don't want to see those payments jeopardized by their own journalists telling this story like it is.
The African media wrote a report and quoted the representatives of African negotiators from Malawi as stating that they were not in Paris to accept anything less than a legally binding agreement. And a few hours later, our journalists from Africa were told that there is need for them to be diplomatic in their reports because American diplomats have warned that their ongoing discussions and for bilateral and multilateral deals would be affected by some of these statements by the African media. And we saw that as an affront on the African interest, which we came to Paris to defend.
The bottom line being that on the reporting of the climate change story, all kinds of countries have their own bottom line. On the climate change story, there are a number of websites that are filling the gaps being left by the mainstream news media, providing different regional perspectives. Carbon Brief is a UK-based website that covers news relating to climate science and policy. as well as fact-checking stories in the mainstream news media on the issue. It offers analysis and interviews that include data and graphics to break things down. The Nigeria-based outlet Climate Reporters covers the issue from an African point of view, publishing material from journalists across the continent that focuses on the effects of climate change on the lives of Africans. And Ambiental is an online news site dedicated to climate change and sustainable development in Latin America. It's based in Uruguay, a country that produces 95% of its energy from renewable resources. And the stories are published by a local NGO, the Latin American Center of Social Ecology. Other media stories that are on our radar this week. The South China Morning Post, a Hong Kong journalistic institution, has a new owner from the mainland. And questions are now being asked over what that means for the editorial independence of the newspaper at a time when Beijing is trying to tighten its control over Hong Kong. The new owner is Chinese billionaire Jack Ma, who controls an e-commerce giant called Alibaba. Alibaba said the purchase is aimed at improving China's global image and offering an alternative to the Western news media. In an open letter to readers, Alibaba executive Joseph Tsai said that the Morning Post will be objective, accurate, and fair, and that the editorial decisions will be driven by editors in the newsroom, not in the corporate boardroom. We did a piece on the paper last year in which concerns were already being raised about its independence, given that the South China Morning Post was owned by Robert Kwok, a Malaysian tycoon with close ties to Beijing. Egyptian authorities have extended the incarceration of investigative journalist Ismail Alexandrani, and the number of media workers behind bars in Egypt is reportedly at an all-time high. Alexandrani was arrested late last month at the airport in Hurghada. He had been living in Turkey and returned to Egypt for family reasons. He is accused of releasing false news aimed at spreading terror and allegedly joining a banned group, the Muslim Brotherhood. In his reporting, which appeared in Lebanese newspapers As-Safir and Al-Modon, he had criticized the Egyptian army's efforts to counter Islamist groups in the Sinai Peninsula. Also this past week, photojournalist Mahmoud Abu Zaid, also known as Shao Khan, appeared in court for the first time after 2.5 years in jail, only to hear that his trial has been adjourned until February. Shao Khan was arrested while covering clashes between Egyptian government forces and supporters of the ousted President Mohamed Morsi. According to the New York-based Press Freedom Organization, the Committee to Protect Journalists, the number of jailed media workers in Egypt has roughly doubled since last year, with at least 23 now behind bars. Spain's gag law, which journalists say amounts to a form of state censorship, is being put to the legal test at the European Court of Human Rights. Officially known as the Spanish Citizens Security Law, it went into effect 6 months ago. This law strictly regulates the right to protest, where those protests can occur, and threatens the media with fines of up to 30,000 euros for publishing images of police officers at such demonstrations. 3 parallel lawsuits were filed with the court in Strasbourg this week by journalists affiliated with a group called Defender a quien defiende, to defend those who defend. It is no coincidence that the case was taken to Strasbourg at this time. Spain holds parliamentary elections this weekend. All the major opposition parties have pledged to repeal the gag law if elected. The court's decision, however, on whether to hear the case is not expected for months. We're going to look at a big news story from Chicago now, and the journalism that went into breaking that story. When Laquan McDonald, a black teenager, was shot dead by a police officer more than a year ago, the police report said that the officer was acting in self-defense, and many news outlets covering the story went along with that account. However, the killing had been filmed on a police dashboard camera that the department did not want released. It showed a white officer shooting McDonald 16 times, emptying his gun as the young man was walking away. After being tipped off by a city official about the video's existence, a group of independent journalists, lawyers, and activists who were low on funding but high on determination filed a successful lawsuit to get that video released. When the video came out, it provoked a public outcry and a political firestorm. The Listening Post's Marcela Pizarro now on the makeshift journalistic coalition that managed to succeed where Chicago's mainstream media had failed in getting the truth out, getting the story.
Brandon Smith, a journalist who makes a living by doing a bit of cab driving on the side, and who just broke a story that has put the Chicago police, the mayor, and post-racial America in the dock. Because it was Smith, working alongside activists and lawyers, who filed a successful lawsuit to get a video released under what is known as the FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act.
If we don't get it, shut it down!
Video that the police wanted buried, visual evidence that Chicago teenager Laquan McDonald was shot not once, but 16 times, the entire contents of a semi-automatic, despite the fact he was walking away, and proof that police lied about his death.
The video was denied to a bunch of news organizations. And a friend of mine who's a lawyer knew this activist, William. And this friend got in touch with me and said, hey, this activist wants to know if you could help him get this video out.
I told multiple reporters and journalists before Brandon. Brandon was the one that took the initiative to look into it deep more and filed a FOIA request. We need more journalists like him that once, members of the African American community come with information like this, they will respect it to look more into it. You know what I mean?
Smith was not the only one to file a FOIA. 15 other media outlets did the same. Police argued releasing the video would harm the investigation. Mainstream outlets chose to push no further.
Video aren't just given out freely. The city, the state, every sort of local entity, they all get away with these things by saying it's under investigation. We could request the video all we wanted. It really comes down to, are you willing to sue to get it?
There are something on the order of 40 to 50 police shootings a year in Chicago, and routinely they are reported the same way. It's like a recipe, quote unquote, police involved shooting in this or that neighborhood, almost always an African American victim, and that's the end of the story. It evaporates.
Importantly, in Illinois, provision of FOIA law is that attorneys can demand payment from the government if they win their cases against the government. So that means that independents like me don't have to save up our money to pay a lawyer. So in this case, this attorney, Matt Topic, decided, hey, this is a good case. I think we can win it. Let's bring it against the city. And ultimately, we did win it.
Smith's lawsuit was the last chapter in a year-long effort to break this story. There was also Jamie Calvin, director of the Invisible Institute that tracks police violence, working with lawyer Craig Futterman. They were the first with the autopsy reports showing 16 shots to McDonald's body. On November the 23rd, a judge ordered the video's release. But before they made the video public,
a veteran Chicago police officer has been charged with first-degree murder.
Officer Jason Van Dyke was charged 13 months after the shooting. When the video came out a few hours later, people saw why. Everyone, from the mayor to the police chief that the mayor then fired, had questions to answer. But Brandon Smith wasn't allowed into that press conference, apparently because he had no accreditation. He ended up tweeting questions to reporters inside on a case that is now under investigation by the US Federal Department of Justice.
It's been this kind of narrative phenomena of chipping away at the city's account of what had happened. The video becomes public, and the degree to which that has rocked the city and opened up possibilities that I think we could hardly have imagined for necessary police reform is, we're all kind of absorbing this moment.
The video and a lot of these things are kept out of reporters' hands, and their main reason is because it makes them have to answer uncomfortable questions. If we come to them with their questions, sometimes their best course of action is just to kind of stall until something else pops up in the 24-hour cycle, and then it's quickly forgotten.
Forgotten or conveniently glossed over? Because if you're a reporter working at the Chicago Tribune, the Sun-Times, CBS, NBC Chicago, there may be sources at City Hall or at the police department that you may want to preserve, access you don't want to compromise, which is why stories on local police are sometimes better told by journalists working outside of those mainstream institutions.
It's a really good question to ask of mainstream news organizations. Are you too close to your source? The idea being that reporters don't want to rock the boat so much because they kind of rely on those people to give them the information they need to make content.
It takes a tremendous amount of energy to move against that gravitational field. And I think the press generally has, without a lot of reflection on it, has found it easier just to publish the police blotter. And then you couple that with a kind of submerged racism. I think these are the most important stories in the city, judging by the allocation of resources and manpower by the major media until it becomes, a big story like Laquan McDonald has. That's not the case. There's not that institutional commitment to cover these issues.
Commitment and resources. In the past year, the Chicago Sun-Times said it would be cutting as much as 22% of its staff. The Tribune, 7%. The latest cutbacks as revenue continues to drop and circulation to decline. And then there's local TV affiliates in Chicago, media powerhouses that have no lack of on-screen diversity, but who are also slaves to the laws of the news market. Perhaps a slow-moving story like the McDonald case wasn't seen as a ratings winner.
I think it's a lot of journalists and reporters that do great work. Unfortunately, I think that maybe the producers or the owners of these networks are more caught up with the current events. This case with Laquan McDonald happened over a year ago. So I think that the mainstream media sometimes get too much caught up on what's happening right now.
I would always go back to the question of, what are your priorities? What do you care about? What are your values? What's your fundamental sense of vocation as a journalist? We have a moment right now where there's a recognition in this sort of post-Ferguson era that these issues of economic inequality, radical structural inequalities enforced by patterns of police policies and practices and abuses, these are the central and defining issues in American life. And so I think the question for journalism is, how are we equal to that moment?
Brandon Smith has taken up that challenge. And he may well end up with a job and his own byline at one of the big papers in Chicago as a result. At which time, the question will become, will he still be able to? Will he be allowed to do the kind of journalism that got him there when he gets there?
Finally, among the candidates working to dislodge Donald Trump from the top of the polls in the Republican race for the White House is Ted Cruz, U.S. Senator representing Texas. Now you can see just how hard he and his family have been working, because they're all over YouTube. Under U.S. election law, political campaigns cannot coordinate directly with so-called super PACs, the political action committees, big money organizations that back their favored candidates. So the official campaigns post raw footage of the candidate and their families online for super PACs to then download and use in their ads. Journalists have also been having a field day since that footage is sprinkled liberally, you might say, with some awkward outtakes, schmaltzy family scenes, and some staged hugs that'll make you squirm. There are 13 hours of this material up on YouTube. We've selected some of the most revealing moments for your consideration. And we'll see you next time here at the Listening Post.
You got to train me. I'm sorry.
No, you're doing great. You're very natural on TV.
I don't know what else to say.
I don't know. Just keep talking. Just keep talking. I'm just thinking.
Are we rolling or not?
Yeah, we're still rolling.
Every $5 donation makes a difference. Every $10 donation makes a difference.
That kind of... My mother is quiet and soft-spoken, but she has a will of steel.
$20 and $50 and $100 and $1,000 makes an enormous donation.
Not a day goes by that my mom is not lifting me up in prayer.
That's true.
For hours at a time.
$5, $10, $20, $50.
I consider Uncle Ted to be like my best friend, almost.
They're,
I love you, Ted.
I love you.
I love you, Ted. I love you.
I love you, Mom.
Love you, Judy.
I'm Ted Cruz, and I approve this message. I'm Ted Cruz, and we approve this message. Okay, a little bit faster, though. That was good.